Hello and welcome to the edition from The Spectator. I'm William Moore, The Spectator's features editor, and the magazine has just gone to print. To talk about what's inside it, I'm delighted to be joined by Freddy Gray, our deputy editor and the editor of Spectator World, Lara Brown, The Spectator's commissioning editor, and broadcaster and Fora Tory MP, Miriam Cates. Thank you very much indeed for joining me. Well, let's talk about the cover piece first, which is Arctic Roll, Paul Wood on the battle for Greenland. Freddie, wonder if you could start by telling our viewers and our listeners how this cover came about.
Well, we should probably start by saying that Donald Trump has very frustratingly, because he's determined to make life miserable for journalists, just said that he won't use force on Greenland, against Greenland, to take Greenland.
I'm mad because people thought I would use force. I don't have to use force. I don't want to use force. I won't use force. All the United States is asking for is a place called Greenland.
Which has rather disappointed a lot of people on social media, I've noticed, who actually really hate Donald Trump because they want him almost to be this antagonistic figure. And we thought we would we ran an interesting piece online last week by David Whitehouse about the sort of fight for Greenland is really about satellites and data. And the Golden Dome, of course, uses data from satellites to sort of see missiles coming in. And so everybody says it's about minerals, which of course it is, but about shipping lanes, it also is about that. But the kind of data element's really interesting. So because of that, we thought we'd do a piece about the kind of strategic fight and the strategic importance of Greenland and why Trump wants it so much. And Paul Wood's done a really interesting piece about the kind of the way America sees it.
But interestingly, his argument is that Greenland actually isn't the most strategically interesting part of the Arctic. Well, the Arctic's very important strategically, but Greenland itself is a bit of a red herring, to mix my colours up a bit.
Well, so there are some people in Washington who think that the conversations between Putin and Trump about Ukraine turn towards the Arctic quite a lot. And that the sort of conspiracy theory is that between them they have decided that Putin will assert himself more in the northern part of the Arctic, Svalbard and the Norwegian areas, and Trump will therefore says, well, we'll take Greenland and we'll sort of block off there. If that's true, nobody knows if it is. That's very, very interesting. And I think that is one of the underexplored elements. We got a lot of like European delicate offended sensibilities and all this. But the future of warfare between these, massive powers of China, Russia and America, that's what Trump's really concerned about. And I think it's something that Europeans need to be more realistic about in the future because they, as is quite clear, they can't defend Ukraine by themselves. They can't mount a serious defence of the Arctic if it ever comes to that by themselves.
Lara, what do you make of that? That the idea that this is, a bit like Peter Mandelson said in his piece of Spectator a couple of weeks ago, that a lot of these big American foreign policy actions, they're just wake-up calls for Europe, really.
I think there's a lot of truth in that. I mean, the interesting thing about this Greenland story is that Denmark is sort of floundering and saying, gosh, if you do try and invade, you'll break up NATO, and they're having to try and convince Trump not to, and we're focused on that. But the interesting question is, at no point has anyone indicated that Denmark could do anything to defend Greenland if Trump changed his mind. And therefore, one has to assume the same is true of Russia and China. And if Greenland is somewhere that you'd want to launch tactical missiles from, if it's useful on the basis that it's just near a lot of strategic things, if China want it, as Paul Wood argues they might, there's nothing that we can do without America's support. So it's just another case of us all being completely in hock to the desires and interests of the Americans because they have the defence investment and they have the military that no one in Europe really has bothered to invest in.
I mean, Miriam, what do you make of Paul's piece? And I mean, do you think there is a method in Trump's madness when it comes to Greenland?
Well, I think that is the key question, isn't it? We're all scratching around trying to find an explanation for Trump's latest attempt to disrupt what we would have seen as the normal world order. And I think what's different about Greenland is that in all of the other Trump interventions, so whether that's been pulling back on support for Ukraine, the Venezuela operation, bombing Iran, there is a kind of explanation that you can come up with, which is why this is good for America, why this is good for the world, why this actually isn't an interventionist policy, whatever that is. Whereas I think I'm just stumped when it comes to Greenland. And there's some fantastic ideas and speculations about why Trump might want Greenland. But for most of those reasons, which are good ones to do with security and minerals, it seems to me that he could have those things if he wanted to through negotiation, through existing contracts. So that brings us back to the question, is there method in his madness, or is he just mad? Yeah. And I increasingly do think that is a plausible explanation, that his character type, his temperament, is that he's seen something that he wants. Ego, success are very important to him, and why shouldn't they be? But I think people are now starting to compare him with Putin and dictators. And I think the different thing is that this is a democracy, that he will be gone in 3 years' time, probably, that there are people around him that surely must pull him back from the brink at some point. And is this just a big game? He wants to show who's boss. He wants to show that he's still a superpower. He gets a kick out of frightening the Europeans. That could be part of it. But only time will tell. But for me, the most disturbing aspect of this is not that Trump is saying disruptive things and unexpected things. It's actually the publishing of the private messages with other world leaders. And I think that marks a big change in the behaviour of diplomats, because if you can't trust somebody to keep something safe in private, then that really does make transatlantic relationships difficult in future.
So how do you view Britain's response to all of these last couple of weeks and all the fuss about Greenland? I mean, it seemed to me that Trump did something rather remarkable, which is unite the leaders of pretty much every party in this country, including a friend of the president, Nigel Farage, in condemning his sort of threats about Greenland. I mean, if Britain really is dealing with someone who you say has gone bad, I mean, how are we meant to act about that?
Well, that's a great question. I do feel a bit sorry for Keir Starmer, because he has tried very, very hard to keep Trump on side, despite the fact that most of the Labour Party would prefer him to be more hostile to Trump. He's tried very hard. And I think, unfortunately, for us in Britain, it hasn't really worked. Donald Trump got his state visits. He's perhaps got what he wants from Britain, but he doesn't have any particular loyalty to Keir Starmer. And in some ways, why should he? But I think the mistake that our whole political class has made for some time is to see America as benevolent and all the other influences in Britain, so China, perhaps Russia, as a negative thing. And I think, of course, we always will be more closely aligned with America culturally. But if you look at how the Americans have treated us since the Second World War, I mean, they basically own vast swathes of our economy. We're going to be talking about big tech later. They own vast swathes of big tech. We pay huge amounts of money to them each and every year. We have become a vassal state. And so I think this idea that America will always have our best interests at heart is not true. And the sooner we wake up to that, the better. And I don't think our leaders, as much as they agree about what Trump's doing right now, I don't think they have fully woken up to that.
Can you say, though, that we're going to either be a vassal state of America or a vassal state of China? Almost, pick your master is the kind of reality.
Well, that is the reality. Yeah. The question is, how have we got to this point, and can we get out of it, even if it is in a gradual way? And I think we should do absolutely everything we can to try and get out of it. And Britain is in a particularly bad way, actually. If you look at American ownership of UK companies and UK workers, it's much more significant than in France, Germany, Italy, for example, where they have rules about acquiring companies from foreign investors, which we don't here. There's not a lot we can do right now to get out of it, but we certainly shouldn't carry on making the same mistakes of the past. I'm not saying we should see America as a hostile state in the same way as we do China. Of course not. We are much more culturally aligned. But neither should we be naive and think that they have our best interests at heart. I don't think the lesson since 1945 is that is true.
Freddie, is Miriam being too harsh on America there, do you think?
No, I completely agree I think one of the few things, I've said this quite a few times, I think probably already on this show, that one of the few things Keir Starmer has handled quite well is Trump. Because I think he recognises, Peter Mandelson, the no longer ambassador in Washington, also recognised, is that with Trump, the madness is the method. And it's one of my favourite Trump quotes is from a New Yorker interview in 1997, where the journalist, who's called Mark Singer, he was sat opposite Trump. Trump was a real estate developer still then, and kind of tabloid celebrity. And he was sat opposite him, and Trump was on the phone doing some completely impenetrable real estate deal. And he put down the phone and said to Mark Singer, "I like to keep things nice and complicated so that nobody knows what's going on." And I think that's exactly what he does in international relations. I mean, what Labour have recognised, what Starmer's recognised, and I think some other diplomats do it, and Asian diplomats recognise it pretty well, and Middle Eastern statesmen recognise it pretty well, is he's got about 6 different lines which he's fishing with at any one time. So, I'm not saying he's a 4-dimensional chess genius. He's just constantly got lots of different things he's just sort of fiddling about with at the same time. So as this whole Greenland thing's going on, of course, there's what's going on in Latin America. There's also Ukraine, which he's going to talk about this week in Davos. There's also the trade deals that he's concerned about, that the EU is striking with Latin American countries and with India. And there's the element of Mark Carney in Canada, possibly just cozying up to the Chinese now, which he sees as a serious problem. So he's always sort of operating on all these different fronts. And as I say, the madness is the method. And I think the sensible response to that is not to indulge in counter-madness. It's to try and take as calm and rational a view as possible.
Speaking of cozying up to the Chinese, Lara, you've written a fantastic piece for the magazine this week, very, very interesting piece about China buying up public schools in this country and creating deals with elite boarding schools across Britain. I wonder, could you just summarise your piece for the sake of our listeners?
Of course. So I think what this piece tries to do is tie together three distinct but very linked trends, which all create huge market exposure of pretty much like the majority of Britain's boarding schools at this point, and a lot of other independent schools, to the Chinese market. The first is that we've seen for about 20 years private school fees go up vastly above inflation every year, which has squeezed parents out. We've then seen Labour make it much more difficult for private schools to operate, particularly for boarding schools, because the VAT has such a large impact on the fees, which means that a lot more British parents can't afford to send their kids there. And that means that head teachers have turned to a market that is far more wealthy, cares about education, and wants a sort of British experience for their kids. So there's been an influx recently in the last 2 decades of pupils into British public schools, Chinese parents and parents from Hong Kong who want to get their child the English-British experience, and that really appeals to them. But then I think far more insidiously, when you look into the accounts of these schools, you see, firstly, that Chinese holding companies or companies backed by Chinese investment firms have been gradually buying up British private schools as they struggle. So you've got charities and companies running British schools that are making next to no profit. They're 5 or 6 pupils sometimes short of suddenly being in a deficit. And they're being bought up on the cheap by Beijing bargain hunters, basically, who realise that all they're really getting is a brand and a school and some teachers. It's not a brilliant investment, but they can turn it into what they want. And you see a sort of very reliable trend take place when these schools are bought, where suddenly they get a few new facilities, they get a sort of new flick of paint, and then they make sure that their boarding market is very internationally operated. So the ISI, so the sort of offset equivalent for private school inspection report for one of the schools that I looked at, noted that their boarding house was almost entirely full of overseas students, which you can charge far, far more. And then the third, and I found the most sort of concerning trend, is that English public schools are now resorting to they've seen this trend and they've realized obviously they can only fill their own dormitories with so many Chinese or Hong Kong students. So they've shipped out almost identical versions of their institutions to China, to Chengdu, Shanghai, Beijing. Wellington College, for example, has built an exact replica of Wellington College in China. They use the crest, they use the brand. What they obviously don't use is any of the English values of democracy or the normal history that you would teach in an English version of Eton or Harrow or Dulwich, because any school in China needs to be run partly by a Chinese company. It needs to have a CCP party liaison, officially or informally involved in some way. And it has to teach the Chinese curriculum. It has to teach Chinese history. It has to teach about China's autonomy over Taiwan, for example, as fact. They can do maybe international baccalaureate on the side if they want, but you may have to provide that Chinese education. And I think that the things that concern me, I think that morally, you have to ask if it's fair for these schools to get into bed with the Chinese government in such an overt way. There's also the fact that most of these schools who've started operations are running huge numbers of satellite schools, mostly in China. And they've got to a point where their profits from these schools, that often have thousands of pupils, vastly outstrip their quite tight margins in Britain. And as a consequence, continual support from the Chinese government is totally essential to their operation. Westminster fell out of the Chinese government and they refused to teach under their rules and will have lost potentially millions in revenue as a consequence. Most of the schools aren't doing that. And that means that their school in Britain has to be careful to not upset the Chinese government. I mean, the example I used in the piece is, would Dulwich invite the Dalai Lama to speak knowing that they have this difficult relationship? I don't think they would. Would you want to host a provocative debate about China? And therefore, I think what we've seen is an entire sector basically now controlled by China, Chinese capital.
Yeah. Miriam, what did you make of Lara's speech? Did it worry you? I mean, are you worried about Chinese investment in education and beyond education as well in this country?
Yes, I think it's hugely worrying on a number of fronts for all the reasons that Lara has so brilliantly put. And I think it reflects how little we value our private schools actually in this country. And obviously the Labour Party have reinforced that by adding VAT to independent school fees, which has priced out many British families. Independent schools themselves have been putting fees up and up over the years, probably more than they've needed to. And really, private education has been out of fashion as we've become more concerned with equality and things like that. And I think we've forgotten the enormous contribution that Britain's independent school system has played in the past to producing brilliant leaders. Some of our best leaders and diplomats and civil servants have in the past come through these schools, and I think we've forgotten the value of them. And so the idea that actually fewer and fewer British people are going to be educated in these schools and less of our kind of traditional type of education is going to be apparent in those schools is hugely worrying for our future, quite apart from then the political influence that China is exerting in these schools. But I think it's another example of how we've just sold the family silver. Yeah. And in other countries, like China, they have strict rules about making sure that children are educated in a certain way, that their own history is taught, that their own culture is taught. And I think we've almost assumed that brand Britain, because it was so wonderful in Edwardian times, would just continue even if we flogged off everything that built that brand. And I think that is what's happening now. And you just think, how do we get back from this? Because independent schools are not going to recover under this current government, and a future government will make it quite hard to row back on, it seems so elitist, doesn't it, to row back on the rules around VAT. But we should be putting rules in place about whether or not schools can be bought by foreign owners.
Well, the irony is, I mean, and Lara points this out at the end of her piece, that, I mean, if you trash the brand that much, at the end of it all, the Chinese parents end up pulling their kids from the school because they're paying for what they see as a unique British boarding school experience. But if the whole thing's been diluted anyway,
that's why I think it's sort of testament to the treacherous power of branding.
Yeah,
because I think a lot of these Chinese people think that a British public school education is the best thing ever, and I think most British people realise that, to a large extent, and I speak from experience, British public schools are very good at producing people who think they know a lot more than they actually do. So perhaps it's a genius British subterfuge to make the Chinese make terrible mistakes because they're a bunch of privately educated, conceited.
So they'll take their boarding school education back to the top of government in the CCP.
Exactly.
And,
start teaching that there are 72 genders.
Yeah, exactly.
Chinese David Camerons.
Yes. In which case, the plan is working as intended. Should we move on to domestic politics? Because Tim Shipman and James Heal have interviewed Robert Jenrick for the magazine this week, his first interview since his defection to Reform. I think, Miriam, I got to start by asking you what you made of Jenrick's defection. I mean, presumably it was quite expected by most Tories and former Tories at this point.
Like everybody, I was surprised by the method and how it happened. Obviously, it was quite a shocking day in Westminster politics. The kicking out of Robert Jenrick, the will Nigel accept him or not, that lasted a few hours. It was quite an exciting day for those of us in live news.
I feel sorry for Amol Rajan, who announced that he was leaving today at the exact same time.
That's such a good point. I hadn't thought of that. But am I surprised that he's gone to Reform? No, I'm not. And I think many of the things that he said in that press conference and then in subsequent interviews, I absolutely recognise from my own time in the Conservative Party. I think one of the interesting debates that's come out of it is Britain broken? This almost seems to be like a new Spanish Inquisition. If you think it's broken, then you can join Reform. If not, you have to stay in the Tories. But, it's just an incredible realignment that's going on in our politics. And I actually rate Robert Jenrick very highly. I work quite closely with him in some of the debates in the last Parliament over the failed Rwanda bill, for example. I think he's extremely hardworking, extremely intelligent, very good media performer, a good orator, actually, one of the few in Parliament who could stand up without notes and make a compelling case. He's a massive asset to Reform. But I suppose the question is the Conservative Party stronger or weaker without him?
And how would you answer that question?
I think weaker, because I think a lot of people worth sticking with the Conservative Party, probably because he was there and because he represented a more hardline right-wing politics than people assume most Conservative Party MPs represent. And I think, the question he asks, can the Conservatives change enough to win back people's trust, but also deliver change at the next election, is an open question. I feel incredibly sorry for Kemi Badenoch. To have to rebuild the party after a huge defeat with somebody breathing down your neck from the right is very, very different to what Thatcher had to do in the 70s. But the big question for me is the parties are in very similar places now on policy, really similar places now on policy. Is it in the national interest to go into the next election with two parties splitting the vote? And I suppose it's too early to say, will Reform get higher in the polls? Will they get to 35? In which case, there's no point to the Conservative Party. But if they stick on 25 and 20, got to do a deal, surely.
Yes. Lara, a deal coming down the tracks?
It's really hard to say. I mean, I think Kemi is, by the day, developing more and more animosity towards Farage, which I think is going to limit things. And I think Kemi's odds of remaining leader have just gone up tenfold by Rob's departure. I thought the most interesting thing in this piece was that Rob notes that a lot of the donors that he had relationships with were quite interested in his defection and might follow him to Reform. And while Kemi had that very shaky start that we've talked about, she was very good at bringing money in. And I think the party's survival has been really contingent on having quite a lot of donors. And now we've seen Zahawi go over, who obviously intellectually is really no great loss, but he is himself very wealthy and will know a lot of people who can donate to Reform. And we've seen Rob, who we know was bankrolled his whole leadership campaign, is good at raising money. I think his wife's very good at raising money, also go over. And if there's a big shift in the balance books and Reform become the wealthy party, the Tories are probably going to lose Matthew Parker Street if Reform were able to buy it, things like that. They get the ground institutions that cost money. I don't really see how the Tories continue without a deal. But I also don't really see how they get a deal, because any deal basically is Tory money plus Reform electorability.
Presumably at this point, Reform don't particularly want to do.
Well, this is the thing that seems to be missed in the deal thing. I mean, the only thing the Tories had previously was donors.
Yeah.
If they haven't got donors, they've got a toxic brand no one likes, a set of MPs who are mixed at best, and Reform has whoever they want to select as a complete blank slate. It could be great, it could be terrible, and they had some donors who they're losing. So what's in it for Farage? We keep asking Tories if they'd go to the negotiation table, and we're not interested in whether Reform have anything to gain from a pact.
Yeah. Freddie, what do you think?
I thought what struck me most about the interview was that it sort of zoomed out quite effectively. Jenrick did quite a good job of zooming out effectively from the psychodrama or comedy drama of the last few days. And, the fundamentals are still very much in Reform's favour at the moment. We get very excited about whether Kemi got an upper hand last week or whether she's doing a bit better in PMQs, and, minor shifts in the polls are massively overinterpreted. But the fact is Reform are still dominating British politics outside of Westminster. And Jenrick talks about going to some event where masses of people showed up, and this sort of slightly unbelievable story about knives being taken off.
Oh, yeah.
Was it 50 knives? 40?
40, I think.
40 knives being taken off people because they were apparently work class people.
Yes.
That had
not
to hand over their knives.
Yeah.
Yeah, that had to hand over their knives after a shift. I mean, whether that's true or not, there is undeniably a very powerful movement that wants to support Reform. And as Miriam says, we are going through a realignment of our politics. We've almost had the realignment in our politics. Pro-Tory writers last week saying this is a great moment of clarity for the Conservative Party. What is that clarity? I can't see it. I can't see where the Tory party clearly goes from here. There's this sort of strange battle as to whether they're a kind of economically centred version of the Lib Dems or whether they're Reform but you can trust us. Because on either question they fail.
I thought the one irony of this piece is that Robert Jenrick says the Tories are Charles hiding, he's a Civil War buff apparently, and he's watching the Civil War turn. But he's accidentally set up a very good analogy for Farage, because I think Farage as a Cromwell type figure works very well. He's bright, he's good, he's probably going to win in the short term, but he's blighted by an inability to find a successor, an inability to therefore continue a regime. And I wonder if Rob was aware of that irony hidden in his metaphor.
Unless he wants to be the heir, of course, which people say he does at some point.
Well, he's certainly well placed to be that now, if he want to be. I don't think Reform are out of the woods yet at all. And the reason for that is not that they aren't doing very well at the moment than they are, and they've clearly got the momentum, and they've got 2 more MPs in just the last week, which is obviously a big win. But they're still only on 25% of the polls, perhaps 28, depending on which poll you look at. That is nowhere near enough to win a general election confidently. And until a few general elections ago, the winner always was on 42, 43, 44%. There's no party anywhere near that now. We're so fragmented. And this is why, although Reform are clearly the most popular party at the moment, they are very vulnerable to an anti-Reform, anti-Nigel Farage pact at the next election by the parties on the left, possibly even the Tories, who knows? And so I just think unless Reform gets to a stable 35% in the polls, there is perhaps still something they can gain from doing some sort of deal with the Tories, because we've heard so much about the national interest this week. And I think some of it is being grossly unfair, actually, I think, because politicians should act in their own personal interest. What's the point of being a politician if you don't try and get elected? You're a pretty useless politician. So hopefully your personal interest should align with the national interest. That's the kind of sweet spot. But you would hope that the people at the top of Reform, and hopefully the Conservative Party, nearing the next election, if they think that actually the most likely outcome is a left-wing coalition that they are desperate to avoid, then surely the national interest should kick in at that point. It is too early, of course. Perhaps Reform will hit 35 or 40%, but they're a long way from that at the moment.
Should we talk about social media bans? Because an issue that is facing the government at the moment and seems to have support from all sorts of different politicians and figures in public life and columnists and all the rest of it is the idea of a social media ban for under-16s, as has been done in Australia. And John Power in the magazine this week writes a sort of thumping case against banning social media for under-16s. Miriam, I'd love to know your thoughts on this. I imagine you disagreed pretty strongly with his...
Well, I did. I thought it was a very odd piece that was... How do I put this kindly? Pretty ignorant of childhood, child development, how human beings develop. But also the central thesis seems to be that children should have liberty. And I don't know any culture in any time in history that has thought that is a good idea. I mean, the whole purpose of raising children is to protect them from the kind of threats and risks that they themselves cannot protect themselves from. And, you know, if you go right down to the biology, human beings are born far too early from a developmental point of view. We have to be, our brains are so big, we couldn't be born if we stayed in the womb any later. But unlike kittens and puppies, we are not fully developed human beings who can be independent within a few months. It takes about 15 years, probably. And during that time, we have to protect children's bodies and brains so that they develop in the way that they're supposed to do and can become the kind of adults that are competent, that can take risks, that can fit in socially. And I think the undeniable fact about social media is that it's completely transformed childhood in the terms of where children get their influence from, which is no longer just their family, their community, the things that their parents can control, but is actually now international. A lot of it is lies, a lot of it's addictive, a lot of it is violent, the kind of things that all generations in the past would have thought it was utterly wrong to expose children to. And so the idea that social media should not be banned because children should have liberty, well, perhaps we should just stop strapping children into car seats. Perhaps we should just leave all the doors open. Perhaps we should just, you know, let a child fly a plane. That's liberty, right? But children shouldn't have liberty. That's the whole point of childhood and the whole point of why parenting is so important. So I don't agree with the thesis. I think also, you know, some of the claims about the Online Safety Act are quite bizarre. The Online Safety Act, yes, has introduced this kind of idea of age verification, but we've now got this meme that it's censored Twitter, which of course isn't true. When I assume he's speaking about the Katie Lamb speech, which contained gruesome and graphic details about some of the crimes that the grooming gangs committed, graphic details that I think no child should listen to. But nevertheless, when the Online Safety Act age verification came in July, Twitter didn't allow you to see that unless you proved your age. Now, in my book, that is not censorship, that's age verification. But also, what hasn't been discussed widely is the fact that that same video was freely available on Facebook, on TikTok, on YouTube, without any of those contingent warnings, which says to me, Elon Musk has something in this. He doesn't want support for regulating Twitter, very obviously. And so he's using this particular issue to make sure that Conservatives do not support the Online Safety Act or any kind of regulation of the internet. So again, there's a lot in there that I disagree with, obviously, but I think the most important thing here to recognise is that social media has radically transformed childhood. And if you look at so many of the metrics, whether that's mental health, which of course is subjective, but also actually how many times kids turned up in hospital for self-harm, or the way that people's politics have changed. There is this kind of year zero around 2014, which is when smartphones, broadband, and social media got widely adopted. It is international. Nobody at the moment has a better idea or a better thesis than this is caused by social media. If it was some sort of drug that was making kids sick, we would take it off the market, keep them safe, make a precaution, and then find a way to test it. That's the right thing to do with social media. You don't have to prove beyond doubt that Facebook is making kids sick. We've got a clear idea of why that might be, stop them being exposed to it, and then go back and look at the detail.
Freddie, you were a parent of teenagers. I mean, would you support a ban for under 16s?
Yeah, I would. Because, I mean, I really like John Power. I think he's a brilliant guy, but he spent way too much time on the internet. And
it sets him free by the sound of it. That's how he would argue it.
It sets him free.
Wikipedia set me free.
Yeah.
It set him free. And I think he does point towards actually the level of determination of young people. And John's not under 16, but if we were to take under 16-year-olds, the internet away from under 6-year-olds, they would find ways. I think that is a real problem with imposing any ban. But I do. My child, we were going to wait till 16 with my eldest, but we caved this Christmas at 15 under immense pressure, a weak moment, and already we're regretting it. It's poisonous. I do think an interesting part of this is why the Labour Party is so fixated with X and Elon Musk, when actually TikTok, Snapchat, they are just as poisonous.
Worse in some ways.
Worse in some ways because they're not right wing. But no, I mean it is obviously an incredibly difficult issue, and an easy point to make, which I think sort of John pushes towards, is that actually it's sort of millennial ex-parents who are just incapable of stopping themselves from using the internet and their children from the internet, which is entirely true.
Yes.
But I defy anybody trying to raise a child at the moment to do it without some kind of help. So I think there is this sort of cry going out across the country for state help in dealing with the internet, particularly in schools. And I think it probably has to be listened to, and it's popular for a reason.
Lara, what do you think? I mean, Freddie touched on there the Labour's obsession with X. And always sort of making noises about just an outright ban of it. I mean, an argument that John makes seems to be almost a bit of a slippery slope argument. It starts with a ban for 16-year-olds and under, but we know Labour's instincts. We know that they just love censoring-free speech. So why would you get on board with what he calls this? I think he calls it an orgy of authoritarianism. I mean, do you think that he's got a point there?
I mean, I think John Power's being very dramatic, but I don't disagree with uniquely that argument in the piece. There's a contingent of Labour MPs who really, really hate X. They've tried to get the entire party off X. I suspect throughout the remainder of their tenure, they're going to push for it to be banned. I don't think this is a step towards it, but anyone who's pushing for a social media ban does have to ask themselves the question of, how they would implement it. And where I struggle is that the only way to get under 16 to under 18-year-olds off social media or off all user-to-user sites, and that in Australia has included YouTube, for example, which feels a bit overzealous, is to require every single person who wants to go on Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, make a Wikipedia edit to prove their age in some way, which would involve, uploading a version of your ID, something with your credit card, quite a detailed check. And that will either give the British government or a social media site as a private company information about where you're born, how old you are, exactly who you are, attached to any account. So you do, to an extent, kill all anonymity the second you bring this in. And that is a very high cost for something that in Australia seems to have accidentally barred a lot of incompetent 50-year-olds off the internet because they don't know how to do the factor recognition. And meanwhile, all the 15-year-olds are laughing at them and they've got their TikTok and they've got their VPNs, etc. And you have to wonder about that. And I also think, there's two other villains here. There's the screens at a really young age, and you can ban social media. It won't mean that 2-year-olds aren't watching Cocomelon on YouTube. And if we look at the child development stuff, that is the really scary stuff. That's the stuff that means kids can't zip up a coat or hold a pen well after they should be able to.
When you see a kid sort of be pushed in a push pram with a little colourful iPad holding it as they're being pushed along. I mean, that's quite a common thing to see now.
I mean, I can't think of the last time I went to a restaurant and saw a child just sat there talking or eating. There's always a screen this far from their face. And we know that's basically like giving a child crack cocaine, and no one seems to be very interested in that. And I think it also is, I lean towards you, Miriam, on the liberty point. I think it's very sad that kids aren't going out alone. I mean, I found out from this piece that the NSPC says you shouldn't leave the house on your own before the age of 12. That is surely absurd. And it does mean that you can take away the, cocaine that is Instagram or TikTok, but what are we going to leave kids with in that world if they can't, go out and explore a field with their friends?
Yes. Well, I mean, that a field with their friends, I mean, that to me highlights quite an important part of John's piece. Actually, I think there's a big difference between the people who raise their children in a city and the people who raise their children in the countryside. And I think if you raise your children in the countryside, it's much easier to let them sort of roam free a bit. The dawn till dusk playing that John describes as a sort of false nostalgia. I'm not convinced there is a false nostalgia if you're in the countryside, but it probably is if you're raising
also,
kids
if you want to let them roam in the city, you really have to give them a phone, and unfortunately a smartphone, because if you give them a brick phone, they just don't take it.
Yeah.
They have absolutely no interest in doing it, no matter how many times you try to force them to do it.
I think what has changed so much about childhood that actually laid the groundwork for screens, starting with TVs and then social media to take over childhood, was traffic. And, when my grandparents were children and there was no traffic on the road, they were free and safe at 4, 5, 6-year-olds to wander around. And actually the real thing and the genuine danger is now traffic. You cannot let a 4, 5, 6-year-old roam around in the city. They genuinely are unsafe. It would be irresponsible parenting to let them do that. And so gradually we've pulled our children more and more indoors, which has then made screens more attractive. And I think the other thing that's changed is we used to have a sense of collective parenting, that raising children was everybody's responsibility. You could tell someone else's child off in the street. You could expect your neighbours to look out for your children. And I think now that the trap that many otherwise sensible conservatives have been drawn into is that parenting is a private matter. Yeah. And if you can't raise your child perfectly on your own, with no help from the state and the wider community, you have failed. Now, that's just absolute rubbish. Like, we are social animals. You have never, ever been able to raise a child and socialise a child on your own as a single parent or even as two parents. No way. The nuclear family unit is not built for that. That's not what it's for. And yet we have allowed ourselves to think that parents, biological parents, are fully responsible for their own children in every single way, which includes keeping them off social media, which is a massive technological change. It's a huge addiction that's built by the biggest companies that have ever lived, that there's no way individual parents can stand up against. But conservatives have got themselves into this blinkered view that if parents can't solve it, parents have failed. Whereas actually this is a collective problem that we as a society are facing, and we as a society should try and solve together, and we shouldn't be leaving it to parents.
You see, I'm so internet addled that when you started talking about traffic, I thought you meant websites.
I had the same thing. I was like,
there you go.
Oh, you're talking about roads, right? Yeah, got it. Got it. That thing. Haven't been outside for 5 years. Yeah.
Talk about playing in streams. No, not live streams, Freddy. I'm talking on rivers.
Traffic lights,
Yeah. Well, finally, shall we talk about Toby's column for this week? Toby Young, because he writes a very amusing, provocative column arguing about the radicalization of the young. But he's not talking about radicalization of angry white men, which we hear so much about and we see in programs like Adolescence. He's talking about what he calls the radicalization of young women, because he says they're being radicalized by the far left. And that if you look at data on this over time, young women's opinions have just become much more left-wing, whereas male opinions have pretty much stayed in the same place. Miriam, what do you think of Toby's column?
Well, he's trying to signal he's in favour of a social media ban. That was my question. I think he's absolutely right, and I think biologically, from an evolutionary point of view, the costs of social exclusion for women are so much higher than for men. And so we've always known that teenage girls particularly tend towards hysteria and trends, whatever that is. It was vegetarianism when I was a child. It's obviously a lot more severe now. So I think it absolutely makes sense biologically that girls particularly are much more affected by the need to fit in. And when you're fitting in with a group of 15 or 16 other girls in your class, there's a limit to how extreme that can be. When your potential audience is millions, billions of people across the world, and you're being fed through algorithms ideas of how you should look, talk, behave, believe, experience, then I can completely understand how girls particularly have become radicalised. But I also think it makes a very important point about when women get married and have children, they become much less radical. And that's completely understandable, because when you become a mother, your protective instinct kicks in, and suddenly you realise that actually boundaries are a really good thing, and a protective male presence is a really good thing, because suddenly all your energy and your future is displaced into your children. And so the problem we've got now is twofold. Firstly, we've got wild ideas being spread on social media that are affecting girls more than boys. But secondly, we've gone from the average age of first birth of 23 years old in 1970 to 31. And so now women are living a huge chunk of their adult life not being mothers and not seeing the need for the kind of boundaries, conservatism, safe social structures, masculine presence that used to be an essential for you once you hit your early 20s. So I think those two trends have combined. And I think it is very worrying. It's worrying for the future birth rate. It's worrying for political division. Toby points out that in South Korea, for example, where this polarisation is most extreme, they also have the most terrible birth rate. So I think that potentially is linked. But another consequence of social media.
Lara, what do you think? Are young women becoming more left-wing, radically left-wing?
I think so. I think that's definitely what's happened. Louise Perry's got an interesting point on the motherhood thing, that women have always been a bit more left-wing because they're typically slightly more empathetic. And before you have kids, you direct that empathy to the whole world. So you worry about, a man crossing on a small boat. You worry about a criminal who's going to go away for too long. But then once you have a child in the family, you centre that in and you tend to drift to the right. And I suspect that's a big feature. But I'm quite glad Toby's written this, because we've had what can only be described as total hysteria from the government and from institutions about the fact that young men are leaning towards reform, they're voting right, they're toxically masculine, and there's been no interest in what's happened with women. And the actual trend borne out by the data is that men have moved 1 or 2 points to the right, maybe, from a position of being relatively equal with women, and women have just sprinted to the left. And then because women in a lot of institutions that dictate social norms, for example, the civil service, most charities are the vast majority of employees and senior employees, they've been able to create an environment which has described men as simply not following them on their sort of leftward journey as radicalization. You had that hilarious video of the man being seduced by a purple-haired woman done by Prevent to warn men about radicalization. You had Adolescent come out to try and convince parents that all of their 13-year-old boys were all sort of imminent murderers if they didn't get them under control. And we've had no interest in why women have so radically changed their politics in such a short space of time. It really, I can't think of many other examples of such a big generational change in consensus
Presumably,
views.
I mean, this ties into your point about South Korea and birth rates. Presumably it makes dating hard if you're young.
Yeah, well, John McMurdoch talked about this quite a lot in some of his research, and he's found that the problem is men are quite happy to date to the left of them. They don't mind, a green voter, vegan, who thinks there's 72 genders, but women are really nervous of dating someone significantly to the right of them, which is a problem for 2 reasons. That was normally the setup. Women are more left-wing generally, but also as the gap widens, the number of potential relationships as a woman you can have becomes very, very small. He thinks part of that could be to do with social censure. So if you bring your reform voting boyfriend to a dinner party, you'll get in terrible trouble with your friends, which means that, again, the pool of options is lower, and I suspect this will have very negative impacts on the birth rate. We've all got our own algorithms now, so you're never exposed to what the men are saying because you're diverted into that tunnel. You've got no idea what the other viewpoint is.
There's a bit of a stereotype, I think, in online world of men pretending to be more left-wing than they are in order to pick up women. But should women actually be pretending to be more right-wing than they are?
Well, I think
to get a man.
I think probably thanks to Elon Musk, it's now changed a bit, and there is there's like a kind of almost like a vicey virtue signalling of being right-wing now.
Oh, so you wanted to highlight how...
Yeah, you'd show how little you care.
Right.
But,
Nick Fuentes.
Quite. Or maybe that's just my algorithm. I mean, I do think the manosphere, the toxic manosphere that is so dreaded by everyone and so increasingly right wing, and I think it probably is. It really was created as a sort of refuge from Me Too and kind of peak woke in 2020, where men, particularly in America, which is such a sort of cultural driver, white men, felt really like the physical world out there where there were jobs and education and important things going on was just despised them. Yeah. And so they retreated to the manosphere or found comfort in the manosphere where they could sort of talk openly about these feelings, and they expressed resentment towards the world, which sometimes leads to vile misogyny, but is also just a kind of expression of hatred of the polarisation that's happening on the other side.
Thank you, Freddy, Lara and Miriam, very much for joining me. And thank you for listening and watching The Edition.